It's been almost a year since I bought a second-hand Steam Deck, and ever since Valve raised the price by $240 in the spring of 2026, I've kept thinking, man, I'm really glad I bought this thing back then. The model you're looking at is a 512GB LCD that I picked up for just $350, and at that price, recommending a Steam Deck was almost a no-brainer. Today, however, things aren't as straightforward. After using the Steam Deck almost every day for the past year, I think I've spent enough time with it to judge it beyond the initial excitement. So, rather than giving you another review or benchmark test, I want to look back on the entire ownership experience and answer a simple question. Who should still buy a Steam Deck at its current price? When I bought the Steam Deck, I had a very specific use case in mind. I wanted a dedicated emulation machine that could also handle the occasional Steam game without any hassle. Something I could pick up at the end of the day, play for maybe an hour before going to bed, suspend with the press of a button, and continue the next night exactly where I left off. And, as it turns out, it has lived up to that role remarkably well. A big part of that comes down to how mature the emulation ecosystem around the Steam Deck has become. EmuDeck handles almost all of the setup for you by installing and configuring the emulators, integrating them into Steam, and generally removing most of the hassle of setting everything up manually. Outside of the BIOS files and ROMs, which you'll need to acquire yourself, for the most part, the process is surprisingly simple. The Steam Deck is powerful enough to emulate virtually every console up to the 6th generation without breaking a sweat, and it can even handle a good number of 7th generation titles. Beyond that, your mileage will vary, so don't go in expecting a flawless 60 FPS performance in every PS3 or Xbox 360 game, let alone newer systems. The same goes for modern AAA games. The deck was never meant to be a powerhouse, so you won't be maxing out recent games at ultra settings, but thanks to the 800p display, I found myself worrying far less about lower graphics settings than I usually do on my desktop PC. For the vast majority of retro gaming though, the experience is excellent. From Atari 2600, NES and PlayStation 1, all the way to the PS2, 3DS, Wii and, yes, even something like Breath of the Wild on the Wii. To set up EmuDeck for the first time, you have to switch over to desktop mode, and funnily enough, that ended up showing me just how versatile the Steam Deck really is. Since desktop mode is only a couple of button presses away, it gives you immediate access to a web browser, a file explorer, media players, game launchers, an IDE, and even a dedicated app store, where you can download everything from productivity software to a torrent client. And the software needed to use pirated executable files? Huh. It's like Valve wanted you to upset the Nintendo ninjas. Basically, the Steam Deck gives you the freedom to turn it into almost whatever you want it to be, and that freedom extends to modding as well. Whether it's plugins through DekiLoader, Nexus mods, fan patches and ROM hacks for older games, HD texture packs or widescreen fixes, it will handle them just like any other PC. Some of my favorite experiences over the past year came from replaying older games with community fixes that simply don't exist on original hardware. But in doing all of this, it also reveals that this isn't really a handheld console. Sure, you can stay in SteamOS, never touch desktop mode and have a perfectly good experience. But if you do that, you're leaving a huge part of the device's value on the table. Make no mistake, this is a handheld Linux PC that just so happens to have a console interface wrapped around it. If you need a desktop, well, plug it into a monitor. If you want to play on the TV, connect it to a dock and pair any controller you want with it. If you wanna sweat using a mouse and keyboard, do it. All of this just works. And I think it's only once you start treating it like a PC, rather than just another console, that you begin to appreciate everything it's capable of. Its versatility is easily the best thing about the Steam Deck, but it's also the reason you'll occasionally be reminded that you are using a PC. And at the end of the day, whether it's Windows or Linux, a PC comes with PC problems. Most of the time, you'll buy a game, press play, and everything will work exactly as you'd expect. The verified badge is usually a good sign, but it's not a guarantee. Some games might carry the badge and run far from expected, while others might be labeled as unsupported and run perfectly fine. Then there are the usual PC quirks. Every now and then you'll have to fiddle with the graphic settings, switch to a different Proton version to get the game working properly, or deal with a launcher that suddenly decides to stop cooperating. Some multiplayer games, like Destiny 2 or Rainbow Six Siege, simply won't run because their anti-cheat systems don't support Linux. And occasionally, you'll have to spend a few minutes on ProtonDB or a Reddit thread figuring out how to get a game running. Personally, I don't think these are major flaws. They're simply part of owning a device as trying to be far more than a traditional console. But it's worth keeping in mind that if you're looking for the same frictionless user experience as a PS5 or a Nintendo Switch, the Steam Deck might not be the right choice. While those systems have their own updates and occasional hiccups, when you press play, you're generally playing. The Steam Deck usually gets pretty close, but every now and then it asks you to solve a small problem first. So if you're buying one hoping you'd get a break from the PC shenanigans, don't count on it. With that said, I still think Valve got one thing almost perfectly right. They understood when people actually use a handheld nowadays. Almost all of my Steam Deck sessions last somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, before bed, while waiting for a video to render, or whenever I have a bit of downtime. And for that kind of use, I honestly think it's fantastic. A big part of that is the battery life, which is all over the place because the Steam Deck isn't playing just one type of game. A modern AAA title like Cyberpunk or Black Myth Wukong can drain the battery in around an hour and a half, while an indie game like Balatro or an emulated PS2 game can last 5 hours or more. If you go even lighter with something like Game Boy Advance emulation at half brightness, you're looking at up to 8 hours of playtime. At first, that kind of range sounds a little annoying, but after a few weeks you get a pretty good feel for how long different types of games are going to last. The suspend feature also deserves a mention. Being able to tap the power button, put the console to sleep and pick up exactly where you left off later that day makes it incredibly easy to fit gaming into your schedule. It does drain the battery more aggressively than you'd expect while it's asleep, so I wouldn't leave it suspended for a whole week, but for day-to-day use it's one of the most useful features on the entire system. Ironically, the battery usually outlasts my hands. At 670 grams, the Steam Deck is a fairly heavy handheld, quite chunky I might say, and after about 40 minutes or so I usually find myself adjusting my grip or resting my fingers for a bit. The smooth plastic shell can also become a little slippery over time, especially if your hands start to sweat. You can solve that with a rubber grip case, but then you're adding even more weight to an already heavy device. That's why I don't really think of the Steam Deck as the kind of handheld you casually carry around. Well, not like it will even fit in your pocket anyway. If you're taking it anywhere, it pretty much has to live inside its carrying case. I appreciate that Valve includes one in the box, but it also takes up a sizable amount of space in a backpack. For me, that's never really been a deal breaker because I don't use the Steam Deck as an all-day carry. As I mentioned, I use it in shorter bursts and for that it's excellent. But if your priority is maximum portability, something that's light and compact and comfortable enough to hold for hours on end, then I'd probably look elsewhere. That's where something like a modded PS Vita, a 3DS or a Switch Lite have a clear advantage. They're all under 300 grams, less than half the weight of the Steam Deck, noticeably smaller and simply easier to carry around. You are giving up a lot of power and versatility, but if comfort and portability are at the top of your list, I think it's a perfectly reasonable trade-off. If I were to describe the Steam Deck in one word, I think it will be compromise. The ROG Ally X is more powerful, the Switch Lite is more comfortable, the Switch 1 or 2 offers a more straightforward plug-and-play experience, a gaming PC will almost always deliver better performance, and a modded PS Vita or 3DS is far more portable, so it doesn't really win any of those individual comparisons. Instead, it sits somewhere in the middle. It's powerful enough to play modern games, portable enough to take with you, comfortable enough for shorter sessions, and versatile enough to become almost anything you want it to be. So, to answer the question posed at the beginning of the video, who should still buy a Steam Deck at its current price? In my opinion, if you plan to use the Steam Deck as your main gaming device, then I still think it's absolutely worth considering. It can replace a traditional console, give you access to your entire Steam library, act as an emulation machine, and do things that no other handheld can quite replicate. However, if you already have a capable gaming PC, a current generation console, or another handheld, and you're only looking at the Steam Deck as a secondary device for occasional gaming, then I don't think the value proposition is there anymore. At its original price, it was an easy recommendation because the amount of flexibility you got for the money was impossible to match. And I suspect that's also why Valve raised its price. They explained the increase by pointing towards higher component costs, and yes, while that is likely one of the factors, the timing is too close to the release of the Steam Machine to be just a coincidence. Had the Steam Deck remained at its original price, the gap between it and the Steam Machine would have been enormous, potentially making the newer device obsolete by default, especially when you consider that, with a dock and some peripherals, the Steam Deck can already be turned into a small living room PC, essentially a Steam Switch. At its current price, the Steam Deck is still a unique device, but its compromises only make sense if you're taking full advantage of its versatility. Otherwise, the price is not justified anymore.